That law, enacted nearly a century ago, was enacted to ensure that the American people were informed when a foreign power engages in political activities or seeks to influence public discourse. The American people are entitled to know when a foreign power is attempting to exploit our country's free exchange of ideas in order to send around its own propaganda. The company never disclosed to the, and that is what we alleged happened in this case. In the wake of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, RT, which was then known as Russia Today, was dropped by its American distributors. The company ceased its formal operations in the United States, and the European Union, the UK, and Canada banned RT's broadcasting. But as RT itself has boasted, the government of Russia continued to use RT to direct disinformation and propaganda. In the wake of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, RT's editor-in-chief said the company had built, quote, an entire empire of covert projects designed to shape public opinion in Western audiences. We allege that as part of that effort, RT and its employees, including the defendants, implemented a nearly $10 million scheme to fund and direct a Tennessee-based company to publish and disseminate content deemed favorable to the Russian government. To implement this scheme, the defendants directed the company to contract with U.S.-based social media influencers to share this content on their platforms. The subject matter and content of many of the videos published by the company were often consistent with Russia's interest in amplifying U.S. domestic divisions in order to weaken U.S. opposition to core Russian interests, particularly its ongoing war in Ukraine. The company never disclosed to the influencers or to their millions of followers its ties to RT and the Russian government. Instead, the defendants and the company claimed that the company was sponsored by a private investor, but that private investor was a fictitious persona. The charges unsealed this morning do not represent the end of the investigation. It remains active and ongoing. In a separate enforcement action, the Justice Department is seizing 32 internet domains that the Russian government and the Russian-sponsored actors have used to engage in a covert campaign to interfere and influence the outcome of our country's elections. As alleged in our court filings, President Vladimir Putin's inner circle, including Sergei Kirilnikov, directed Russian public relations companies to promote disinformation and state-sponsored narratives as part of a program to influence the 2024 U.S. presidential election. An internal planning document created by the Kremlin states that as a goal of the campaign is securing Russia's preferred outcome in the election. The online infrastructure used by the Russian public relations company, known as the Social Design Agency, or SDA, and related actors, included what are sometimes referred to as cyber-squatted domains. These websites were designed to appear to American readers as if they were major U.S. news sites like the Washington Post or Fox News. But in fact, they were fake sites. They were filled with Russian government propaganda that had been created by the Kremlin to reduce international support for Ukraine, bolster pro-Russian policies and interests, and influence voters in the United States and in other countries. Internal documents of the Kremlin describe the content as, quote, bogus stories disguised as newsworthy events, close quote. This malign influence campaign has been referred to as doppelganger. The Russian public relations companies drove viewers to these websites by deploying influencers and paid social media advertisements. They also created fake social media profiles, posing as U.S. citizens, post comments on social media platforms with links to the sites. According to SDA's records, it actively sought to, quote, eliminate the possibility of detection of the Russian footprint. Both of the schemes I have just discussed make clear the ends to which the Russian government, including at its highest levels, is willing to go to undermine our democratic process. But the enforcement actions I have discussed also make clear that the Justice Department will aggressively counter such efforts. And the same is true of the entire United States government. Today, our colleagues at the State and Treasury Departments are announcing parallel actions in both of these matters. Unfortunately, we know that Russia is not the only foreign power seeking to interfere in our elections. As the U.S. intelligence community noted 2 weeks ago, we have observed increasingly aggressive Iranian activity during this election cycle. That includes recently reported activities by Iran to compromise former President Trump's campaign and to avoid an election outcome that it regards as against its interests. Those recently reported Iranian activities also include efforts to obtain access to individuals who themselves have access to the presidential campaigns of both political parties. The Justice Department's message is clear. We have no tolerance for attempts by authoritarian regimes to exploit our democratic system of government. We will be relentlessly aggressive in countering and disrupting attempts by Russia and Iran, as well as China or any other foreign malign actor to interfere in our elections and undermine our democracy. Now I will turn back to the topic of today's meeting. Just as we are dedicated to combating foreign threats to our elections, we are equally dedicated to confront domestic threats against the public servants who administer our elections. Since the 2020 election, we have seen an unprecedented spike in threats against the public servants who do administer our elections. Election officials, workers, and volunteers in communities across the country have been targeted with heinous acts and threats of violence. The following are a few examples of successful enforcement actions that the Justice Department has taken over the past year. In New Mexico, county commissioners and other elected officials were targeted with a series of shootings that the department has alleged in court papers were organized by an unsuccessful candidate for the state legislature who claimed that the election had been, quote, rigged against him. At least 3 of the shootings occurred while the intended victims or their children or their family members were at home. In February, 2 shooters who we alleged were recruited by the candidate pled guilty to carrying out the attacks. In March, the candidate himself was charged in a 13-count superseding indictment. In Arizona, a man sent a state election official a bomb threat warning that if she did not resign within 2 days, quote, the explosive device impacted in her personal space would be detonated. In March, the man was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison for making that threat. In Maricopa County, Arizona, an elections official, a county attorney, and their families were threatened by a defendant who called for, quote, a mass shooting of poll workers and election officials in precincts he believed had, quote, suspect results. His revolting comments included, quote, dead children burn into the memories of people. The county attorney who had been targeted later reported that he, his wife, and 4 children had been assigned round-the-clock protection and issued body armor in response to the threat. And the elections official who was targeted said in a victim impact statement that, quote, while I am the person directly threatened by this case, the impact of such threats is felt by a much larger community, the thousands of committed election workers who operate our democratic processes. When threats are made against any election worker, the impact reverberates throughout the entire community. That defendant was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. In recent months, our enforcement actions have continued. In July, we secured the guilty plea of an Alabama man who repeatedly threatened to kill Maricopa County election workers and officials. In one particularly chilling message, he said, quote, you better not come in my church, my business, or send your kids to my school. You are stupid if you think you are safe. His sentencing is scheduled for next month. Also in July, the Justice Department secured a 14-month sentence for a man who sent a death threat to a Michigan election worker. In a voicemail, he said, quote, 10 million plus patriots will surround you when you least expect it. And he added, we'll kill you. Less than 2 weeks ago, we charged and arrested a Colorado man for allegedly threatening the lives of election officials, judges, and law enforcement officials in both Colorado and Arizona. As I have said before, and I will reiterate again today, these cases are a warning. If you threaten to harm or kill an election worker or official or volunteer, the Justice Department will find you, and we will hold you accountable. In a democracy, people vote and argue and debate, often loudly, in order to achieve the policy outcomes they desire. And the Justice Department will continue to relentlessly protect the rights of all Americans to peacefully express their opinions, beliefs, and ideas. But the promise of our democracy is that people will not employ violence to achieve their preferred outcomes. The public servants who administer our elections must be able to do their jobs without fearing for their lives. That is why this task force has been marshaling the full resources of the Justice Department to aggressively investigate and prosecute threats targeting election workers, officials, and volunteers. And we will continue to do so in the months ahead, when the task force will build on the partnerships with state and local election officials and law enforcement officials tasked with protecting them. Since March, the task force has participated in more than 25 convenings, engagements, trainings, tabletop exercises, including both with our law enforcement partners and with our partners in the election community nationwide. Over the next several weeks, task force representatives will be on the ground meeting with election workers. And in early November, both in advance of and after Election Day, the FBI will be hosting federal partners at its headquarters command center to address events, issues, and potential crimes related to the elections in real time. Election officials and administrators do not need to navigate this threat environment alone. We are here to support them and to make sure they can safely carry out their critical work. Protecting our democracy and protecting our elections was a founding purpose when the Justice Department was established in 1870. The department answered that charge then, and we will answer that charge today as we confront those who would use violence or threats of violence to attack those who administer our elections. And now I'd like to ask the Deputy Attorney General to make some remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Attorney General, and good afternoon, everyone. I also want to start by expressing my sympathies to the families who have been impacted by yet another horrific act of gun violence, this time in Winder, Georgia. I also want to extend the department's support for and solidarity with the members of law enforcement and community members who are responding to this tragedy. Now, we are fewer than 65 days out from the election, and this convening reflects the diverse and aggressive threat landscape that we face and the breadth of the department's work that we are doing to combat those threats. In our increasingly polarized environment, we're seeing continued threats toward election workers, those who ensure that we all can exercise our most fundamental of rights, the right to vote. And we are identifying dangerous foreign actors working to spawn division, discord, and disinformation, particularly across social media. Threats of violence to public officials, including election workers, represent a clear and present danger to our democratic process. That's why we established the Election Threats Task Force to investigate and prosecute the growing number of threats directed at the public servants who make our elections possible. Dedicated career prosecutors and FBI agents carry out this work across the country every single day, working hand in glove with state and local law enforcement. In recent months, as was just detailed, the task force has continued to prosecute threats toward public servants, and we will continue working tirelessly with our law enforcement partners to ensure threat actors answer for their actions. Because a threat to any election official, worker, or volunteer is at bottom a threat to our democracy. The Election Threats Task Force convened today fits into a larger effort by the department to safeguard our elections. A critical element of that work includes combating foreign malign influence activity as illustrated by the actions we've announced today. Our foreign adversaries' primary goal is to undermine confidence in our democratic institutions and values, including working covertly to influence and manipulate our elections. Today's actions, as laid out by the Attorney General, reaffirm that Russia remains a predominant foreign threat to our elections. And as the intelligence community has publicly reported, and as I have previously warned, Iran also is accelerating its efforts to influence our elections, including the presidential election. Today's actions reaffirm the department's ongoing commitment to detect, investigate, expose, and hold accountable all those who perpetrate foreign malign influence schemes. In our work combating and exposing actors affiliated with Russia, Iran, or any foreign actor seeking to influence our election will continue day in and day out without fear or favor. I'm grateful to the members of law enforcement, the prosecutors, and all the public officials working around the clock to protect our election process and to bring to justice those who seek to undermine our democracy. With that, I'll pass it to Director Wray.
Thank you to the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General for bringing the task force together again for this meeting. Before I dive into things, as you heard, FBI agents are on scene in Winder coordinating with and supporting local law enforcement. Our hearts go out to the victims, the community, and all those affected by this awful, awful act. Here with the task force, I know this group is busy year-round working with our partners, especially our brothers and sisters in local and state law enforcement, who are often the first line of defense in protecting election workers from violence and threats of violence. And as we get closer and closer to Election Day, we're going to continue to step up our collective efforts to protect those charged with ensuring our elections run smoothly. As I've said before, election workers, many of whom are volunteers and all of whom are public servants, are the lifeblood of our elections, and we're committed to ensuring that threats directed at election workers receive the swift and thorough response they deserve. Of course, our commitment to protecting elections and Americans' right to vote extends to an even broader array of threats. Threats the FBI, as both a law enforcement and intelligence agency, will continue to work 24/7 to uncover and disrupt. That means aggressively combating attempts by foreign adversaries to undermine confidence in U.S. elections, sow discord, and damage our democratic institutions. The actions announced today focus on Russia, but Russia is by no means the only adversary we've seen try to meddle in our society and democratic processes. Just last month, for instance, the FBI, working with the broader intelligence community and CISA, called out Iran for targeting and attempting to compromise former President Trump's campaign. And we continue to keep a close eye on China's efforts to denigrate down-ballot candidates it sees as a threat, and on their broader efforts to sow discord. So whether it's China, Iran, Russia, or any other country, attempts to meddle in our elections or destabilize our free and open society represent attacks on our democracy. And as long as foreign adversaries keep engaging in these hostile influence campaigns, they're going to keep running into the FBI. Today, we're exposing 2 illegal Russian covert influence operations targeting the American public. The first was run by RT, formerly known as Russia Today, Now, for years, the Russian government has used RT to seed and amplify their propaganda narratives around the world. And while RT America suspended its official operations in the U.S. back in early 2022, our investigation revealed that since at least last year, RT has used people living and working inside the U.S. to facilitate contracts with American media figures to create and disseminate Russian propaganda here. The content was pitched as legitimate independent news when, in fact, much of it was created in Russia by RT employees who work for the Russian government. The second operation reveals even more malign activities by companies working under the direction and control of the Russian government. Companies that created media websites to trick Americans into unwittingly consuming Russian propaganda. Today's announcement exposes those companies and their influence operations that relied on AI-generated content, influencers, and paid social media advertisements to drive internet traffic to their sites and target Americans with disinformation. As of noon today, we've seized those sites, rendered them inoperable, and made clear to the world what they are: Russian attempts to interfere in our elections and influence our society. As the lead agency for investigating threats to U.S. elections, the FBI is focused on ensuring that our laws are respected and enforced. And when we learn that adversaries overseas are trying to hide who they are and where their propaganda is coming from as part of campaigns to deliberately sow discord, we're going to continue to do everything we can to expose their hidden hand and disrupt their efforts. I'll close by saying thank you again to everyone on the task force for the support you're providing us and for everything you're doing to instill confidence in our elections and ensure they're conducted in a way that is safe and fair and legitimate for the American people. Thank you.
Matt, do you have something?
Sorry. That's okay. Thank you. Thank you, Attorney General Garland, Deputy Attorney General Monaco, and FBI Director Wray for your commitment to safeguarding our elections. With your leadership and your support, the Criminal Division's Public Integrity Section continues to spearhead the Election Threats Task Force. There is no mission more critical to the Criminal Division than deterring, disrupting, and punishing criminal threats to our elections. Since we last met with department leadership in May, the task force has filed charges or secured convictions against defendants in Arizona, Colorado, Kentucky, and Michigan, and opened new investigations across the country. The task force is also preparing for Election Day. Our attorneys are meeting with election officials around the country and recently hosted a training for FBI and DOJ personnel nationwide to address threats of violence to the election community and other criminal threats to our elections. And we are continuing to surge additional resources to these efforts. The Public Integrity Section has added 5 attorneys to support its election crimes branch so that we can rapidly respond to reports of election crimes. As we approach Election Day, we will ensure that the team has all the resources it needs to perform its essential work. I could not be prouder of the Election Threats Task Force. As we move forward, I am confident that their dedicated efforts will continue to put us in the best position possible to support and protect the election community. With that, I will turn it over to Assistant Attorney General Matt Olson for the National Security Division.
Thanks, Nicole. Thank you, Mr. Attorney General. As you know, one of the foremost missions of the National Security Division is to protect our elections and our democratic processes from foreign interference. As the American people decide how to exercise their fundamental right to vote in free and fair elections, our laws demand that citizens have transparency regarding the origin of messages from foreign sources. That transparency empowers individuals to evaluate information and to make informed decisions for themselves. We will defend the integrity of our public discourse against any who would seek to break the law and to exert covert influence, regardless of viewpoint or whether that actor is Russia, Iran, or any other nation. Today's charges serve as a reminder that the Justice Department remains steadfast in safeguarding our democracy from foreign interference and protecting the constitutional rights of all Americans. Thank you.
I have a question for Attorney General Garland and Director Wray. Attorney General Garland, Russia today sent a statement to Fox News and some other outlets here, mocking the situation. They had 5 bullet points or 6 bullet points. The first said, ha, 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 ha. 2016 wants its cliches back. In all seriousness, there is a subsection of the country that when they hear Russian interference, they may believe that it's not true, it's not a real thing. How do you assure people this is a real situation?
I'm sure that was much funnier in the original Russian, but for us, it's not funny. This is deadly serious, and we are going to treat it accordingly.
Director Wray, if I can ask you, you've been talking about China for years now and the threat of China. Also Iran, both briefly mentioned Iran and potential influence there. What is your message directly to the leaders of China and Iran who are watching through that camera lens right now? What do you want to say to them over the next few months and beyond?
Knock it off. As long as adversaries keep trying to influence and interfere in our society and our democratic processes, they're going to keep running into the FBI, and we're going to keep calling it out. And I think nations around the world have started to also see the same activity. And it's not the kind of activity we would expect from nations that want to play in the first world space.
Next question, Alana.
Thank you, General Garland. I'm wondering if you can talk about how the Russian effort to influence the election has changed from prior election cycles. What new strategies are you seeing the Russians deploy this year?
Well, I'll talk generally about it, and I'll turn it over to the FBI director and National Security Director if they want to chime in. Look, it's an acceleration of, and it's an increased sophistication of, and it's use of AI and cyber techniques that were not available in earlier elections. So we're just seeing more and more. It's coming faster and faster. It's now AI fueled. They're now using bot farms in a way that was not possible before. And therefore, it's a bigger threat than it ever was before.
I would just say that the reality is that Russia has meddled in our society and tried to sow discord for decades. Really what we're seeing is just more tools in the toolbox with the advent of technology. First it was social media, which provided a bullhorn, and now, as you've heard, AI is its own amplifier. And so whether it's shell companies, fake personas, secret distribution networks, the point is not the message itself. The point is the hidden hand of the Russian government, which deceives Americans into thinking that they're getting information from American sources when in fact it's coming from the Russian government.
Carrie.
Mr. Attorney General, tomorrow is the first hearing in the January 6th case against the former president since the superseding indictment against him. He's called these new charges election interference and a violation of the Justice Department policy against doing something too close to the election. How do you respond to that, and how confident are you that your team has followed instructions from the Supreme Court following that decision?
I stand by the actions of the special counsel. The superseding indictment is an effort to respond to the direct instructions of the Supreme Court as to how to effectuate a new indictment in an ongoing case. The special counsel is required by the regulations to follow the policies of the Justice Department, including the election sensitivities policies, and I'm quite confident that he did so.
Last question, Pierre.
In terms of the Russian interference, can you be more specific in terms of, is it beyond sowing divide, are they pushing a particular candidate this election cycle? What can you give us a sense about the ultimate goal of these actions?
As I said, the effort in this case is to affect the preferred outcome in the presidential election. The documents that we are unsealing today, including the internal Kremlin documents, I point you to those to see exactly what's involved. More generally, the Director of National Intelligence has testified that Russia's preferences have not changed from the preceding election.
Thank you, everyone.